On July 5, 2026, at 02:17 hours local time, the Lukoil-Volgogradneftepererabotka refinery, one of the 5 largest crude processors in southern Russia, was 41 minutes from being struck. This facility processed roughly 15.7 million tons of crude oil per year. It fed diesel and jet fuel south through Rostov, across the Kerch route, and into the logistics chain of Russian forces operating along the Zaporizhia and Donetsk fronts. Without Volgograd's output, the southern military district's ability to sustain armored tempo and air sorties would degrade measurably within days. The Russian security commander believed the refinery was beyond Ukrainian reach. Volgograd sits over 1,000 kilometers from the front. He had no idea Ukraine had been watching this facility for 11 weeks. In 41 minutes, the primary crude distillation unit would be on fire. 19 UJ-26 Beaver drones lifted off from concealed forward launch positions in the Kharkiv region at 01:36 hours, routing northeast before cutting sharply southeast, a deliberate arc to avoid the densest Russian radar coverage along the direct approach. 3 carried shaped high-explosive warheads optimized for industrial tank penetration. 4 were electronic decoys broadcasting radar signatures designed to replicate the larger UTAN-196. 2 carried jamming payloads targeting Russian Panzer acquisition radar in the Voronezh corridor. The remaining 10 formed the primary strike package, racing toward Volgograd at 150 kilometers per hour, hugging terrain at altitudes between 60 and 80 meters, low enough to exploit the radar shadow cast by the Volga steppes' rolling gradient. The Volgograd refinery is not a secondary target. It is not symbolic infrastructure struck for morale. It is a load-bearing node in the fuel architecture of Russia's southern war machine. What moves through its distillation columns becomes the diesel-driving T-72 and T-90 tanks toward Ukrainian positions. It becomes the Jet A-1 keeping Su-25 ground attack aircraft airborne over the Zaporizhia front. It becomes the heating fuel sustaining Russian garrison positions through winter in occupied territories. Losing even partial throughput at Volgograd doesn't just cost Lukoil money. It compresses the operational tempo at which the southern military district can function. Ukrainian planners knew it. What's most surprising about this strike isn't the distance, it's the timing. On July 2, 2026, 72 hours before the raid, the Kremlin announced an emergency diesel export ban, a direct acknowledgement that downstream fuel capacity inside Russia was under stress. Ukrainian officials described the Volgograd raid as the logical continuation of that pressure. Not a reaction to the ban, but the next step in a deliberate campaign to compress Russian refining output faster than Moscow could compensate through rationing or import substitution. The UJ-26 Beaver is a Ukrainian-designed fixed-wing one-way attack drone built for precision deep strike, at ranges the Russian air defense network was never configured to intercept at scale. The airframe is composite, the radar cross-section is small, and terrain-following navigation lets it exploit ground clutter as passive stealth. Operational range exceeds 1,000 kilometers on a fuel-optimized routing. Payload sits at roughly 20 kilograms of high explosive. Modest by conventional standards, but sufficient when directed against exposed piping, heat exchanger assemblies, or the atmospheric distillation column flanges that are the mechanical heart of any refinery's crude processing unit. The navigation stack combines GPS guidance with inertial reference backup, a design choice that gives it resilience against the jamming and spoofing environments Russian electronic warfare units have deployed extensively since 2022. When GPS signal degrades, the inertial system holds the flight path. When signal returns, GPS corrects accumulated drift. The drone keeps flying accurately through electromagnetic noise that has neutralized less sophisticated systems. Here's where the planning got genuinely complicated. The direct southeastern approach from Kharkiv passed through the Voronezh air defense corridor, a layered zone of Pantsir S-1 systems and older S-300 batteries reinforced in late 2025, following Ukrainian strikes on Russian logistics infrastructure in Belgorod. The standard routing used in earlier deep strike operations was no longer viable. Ukrainian mission planners faced a choice: reduce the strike package to use a longer, more obscure routing with smaller fuel margin, or engineer a decoy and jam package large enough to suppress Voronezh radar acquisition windows long enough for the primary strike package to slip through further east. They chose the latter, and it required coordinating 19 airframes simultaneously across a routing that arced nearly 400 kilometers before the final approach to the refinery. The 4 decoy drones entered the Voronezh corridor first, triggering radar acquisition and forcing Pantsir crews to engage. The 2 jamming drones flooded S-300 acquisition radar frequencies with noise. In the 12 to 14 minutes of confusion that followed, the primary strike package continued southeast, unseen. Put yourself in the position of a Russian radar operator at 01:55 hours on July 5th. You have 4 contact tracks entering your sector. Your Pantsir crew engages. You're simultaneously dealing with electromagnetic interference on your primary acquisition radar. You don't yet know there are 15 more tracks 200 kilometers behind you, hugging terrain at 60 meters altitude, already past your outer coverage cone. The intelligence foundation for this operation was built over 11 weeks. Commercial satellite imagery from multiple providers established the refinery's operational schedule. Specifically, the pattern of crude feedstock arrivals by pipeline, which determined when the primary distillation unit would be running at maximum throughput and therefore maximum vulnerability. A unit running full capacity carries more flammable material in its column, more pressure in its processing loops, and more risk of cascading secondary ignition if initial warhead penetration is clean. Ukrainian planners had also identified a specific vulnerability at the Volgograd facility, confirmed by prior satellite analysis and open-source technical documentation. The vacuum distillation tower, adjacent to the primary crude unit, shared a heat exchanger manifold that, if compromised, would allow burning fuel fractions to migrate between processing circuits. 2 warheads at the right points of that shared manifold wouldn't just start a fire, they would start one that the refinery's own internal piping would help spread. Here's the part that still doesn't sit right. In the week before the strike, Russian state media published a segment specifically reassuring domestic audiences about the security of southern fuel infrastructure. A Kremlin-aligned analyst was quoted describing Volgograd as beyond the practical range of Ukrainian strike systems. That segment aired on July 3, 2026. 48 hours later, the vacuum tower was burning. We spent considerable time going through the OSINT documentation on this operation, and one detail kept coming back. The Russian diesel export ban announced on July 2nd was almost certainly a response to internal fuel supply modeling that already showed downstream pressure building. The Kremlin didn't announce the ban because things were fine. They announced it because the refinery degradation campaign was already working. And Volgograd was the next calculated step in that campaign, not a spontaneous raid. At 02:47 hours local time, the primary strike package reached the outer boundary of Volgograd's municipal airspace. The drones had been airborne for 71 minutes. Fuel margins were within calculated parameters. The jamming package in the Voronezh corridor had bought the necessary window. The mission was in its terminal phase. Russian local air defense assets around Volgograd were not configured for this threat profile. The city's air defense consisted primarily of systems oriented against high-altitude conventional aircraft and ballistic trajectories, not a swarm of low-flying fixed-wing platforms approaching from an unexpected northeastern arc at 60 meters altitude. Ground-based radar coverage at that altitude band, at that distance from the city center, had gaps. Ukrainian planners had mapped those gaps from prior reconnaissance data and months of electronic intelligence collection on Russian radar emission patterns. The first 3 drones in the strike package hit the primary crude distillation unit at 02:58 hours. The warheads were timed to strike in sequence, the first penetrating the column casing, the second detonating inside the breached structure where flammable fraction vapors were accumulating, the third targeting the adjacent heat exchanger manifold connecting the crude unit to the vacuum tower. Within 90 seconds of the first impact, the vacuum tower had its own ignition source. The fire spread along exactly the pathway Ukrainian targeting analysis had predicted. The strike was over in under 4 minutes. What happened in the next 6 hours was, in some respects, more significant. Russian firefighting units arrived on scene within 12 minutes, a creditable response time. They couldn't approach the primary crude unit. The combination of ruptured high-pressure process, piping, and burning fuel fractions created a thermal environment that made direct suppression impossible with the equipment on hand. The fires in the vacuum tower weren't extinguishable with foam alone. The burning material was feeding itself from the connected process circuit. At 4:30 hours, the decision was made to isolate the burning section and allow the primary fire to burn itself out rather than risk spreading suppression efforts into adjacent units. The refinery's crude throughput was suspended entirely. The following morning, commercial satellite imagery confirmed what ground sources had reported. At least 2 distinct fire zones were visible inside the primary processing block. Thermal infrared imagery showed residual heat signatures extending into the heat exchanger network well beyond the initial impact points, consistent with the internal spread pathway Ukrainian targeting had anticipated. The crude distillation unit was non-operational. The vacuum tower had sustained structural damage to its upper section. Analysts reviewing the imagery estimated full restoration of the distillation unit would require a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks, and that assumed prompt availability of replacement components not manufactured inside Russia, subject to Western export controls since 2022. Here's the take that will generate argument. The diesel export ban Russia announced on July 2nd was already too late. The refinery degradation campaign had been compressing southern fuel throughput for months before Volgograd. Volgograd didn't create the crisis. It deepened one that was already structural. The ban acknowledged the problem. The strike prevented the fix. Russia's official response followed the established pattern. Initial silence, then a statement from regional emergency services acknowledging a fire at an industrial facility without specifying cause, then, nearly 18 hours after the strike, a defense ministry statement claiming air defense systems had intercepted the majority of hostile unmanned aerial vehicles targeting the Volgograd region. No confirmation of refinery damage. No acknowledgement of the vacuum tower. The statement was technically accurate in one narrow sense. Some drones in the decoy package had been intercepted. The strike package had not been. What do you think the threshold is? How many refineries need to burn before the Kremlin's fuel rationing decisions visibly degrade Russian battlefield tempo? Military analysts are actively modeling that question, and there's no clean number. The Volgograd strike matters beyond its immediate physical damage. Volgograd sits at the geographic center of the fuel corridor that moves product south into Rostov and then eastward across the Kerch route into Crimea. Rostov is the logistics hub of the southern military district. Crimea is the base from which Russian forces conduct Black Sea operations and from which rocket strikes reach Ukrainian cities in the south. Degrading throughput at Volgograd doesn't just hurt Lukoil's quarterly numbers. It compresses the fluid that keeps that entire southern operational architecture moving. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has, by mid-2026, struck refineries, fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities, radar installations, and airfields across a belt extending from Pskov in the northwest to Volgograd in the southeast. A strategic depth no Ukrainian Air Force sortie could have achieved in 2022. The UJ-26 Beaver and systems like it have effectively extended Ukraine's operational reach to match Russia's geographic depth, not fully, but sufficiently to impose real costs at the infrastructure layer where wars are ultimately decided. The Kremlin will respond. It will likely accelerate deployment of additional air defense assets around major refining and logistics nodes in the Russian interior. It will examine routing and radar coverage gaps in the Voronezh corridor that allowed the July 5th package through. It may attempt to relocate some fuel blending and storage functions to sites further from Ukrainian drone range. Each of these responses costs money, displaces military resources from the front, and consumes the political bandwidth of an administration already managing a diesel supply crisis. For the southern military district, the weeks following the Volgograd strike will see increased pressure on alternative fuel sourcing, Central Asian pipeline supply, domestic reserve drawdown, and accelerated rail movements from Siberian refineries not yet within Ukrainian strike range. Whether those alternatives can fully substitute for Volgograd's lost throughput in the critical summer operational period remains, as of this analysis, an open question. Comment below. What you think is the next node in Russia's southern fuel chain that Ukrainian planners are watching? We read every response. The Volgograd Refinery isn't burning because Ukraine got lucky. It's burning because Ukrainian planners spent 11 weeks building the intelligence picture, engineering a routing around a reinforced air defense corridor, and calculating the precise manifold junction where 2 warheads would do the work of 20. The drone campaign that began as a tactical improvisation in 2022 has matured into something Russian strategic planners did not design their interior infrastructure to survive. Every refinery within 200 kilometers of the front line is now inside the operational planning horizon of Ukraine's long-range strike corps. And Russia is running out of easy answers.